Her own wedding party locked her away. A Lakota chief set her free. The smoke from the burning wagon reached us before the smell did. I was on the ridge above Crow Creek with two of my men, Chayton and his younger brother Motto, and we'd come up that way to check the state of the cottonwoods along the water's edge. A dry year, a fire year, and I had been watching the tree lines since the first moon of summer. The leaves had been turning early on the creek bends, going yellow before their time, and I'd seen what that could mean in the years of 1864 and 1870, years when the fire came and moved through the grass faster than a running horse and left the ground black and bare for a season. I had learned to watch for the signs of it long before a flame showed anywhere. But the smoke that morning came from the south, from the direction of the Traders' Road, and it was too thick and too black to be a cook fire or a signal. It had the particular heaviness of burning pitch and lacquer and cloth, the smell of things that were made with craft and expense, and were now burning up all that effort in a few minutes. I said nothing to Chayton. He had already turned his horse. We came down off the ridge at a canter and crossed the creek at the shallow bend, where the mud shows the tracks of everything that drinks there. Deer, antelope, once in the past spring a grizzly whose prints were bigger than my spread hand. We crossed without stopping and rode south through the grass, which was tall enough that summer to brush my knee on horseback, and the grass smelled of the recent rain and of the particular dry edge underneath it that told me the moisture hadn't gone very deep. The kind of grass that would go off like tinder in 3 days of wind. By the time we crested the low rise that looks down onto the Traders' Road, I could see what was burning. It was a wagon, a good one, not a settler's rig but a proper conveyance, lacquered wood and brass fittings, the kind that carries people who consider themselves important. It had been painted black with a red panel below the windows, and the paint was what had caught so readily, curling up and burning blue at the edges the way paint does. One of the wheels had come off. I couldn't tell whether it had come off before or after the fire started, and the whole body had toppled sideways into the ditch at the road's edge and was well and truly burning by the time we rode up. The horses were gone, cut free or run off. There was a length of harness still attached to the singletree, the end of it frayed in a way that said a knife had done it in a hurry. Whoever had been driving was not in sight. There were tracks in the road dust, boot prints and horse prints, a confusion of movement that told the story of something quick and rough. Not a raid with any strategy to it, not a battle with any declared sides, just men taking what they wanted from people who had less of a say in the matter than they deserved, and riding off before the consequences could catch up. I got down and read the tracks, 6 sets of hoofprints, all going west. The horses had been standing briefly and then moved out at a trot and then a lope by the look of the spacing, not fleeing, not panicked, just men who had done what they came to do and saw no reason to hurry now. The boot prints were varied, different heels, different sizes, several men moving around the wagon before the fire. They'd had time to be deliberate about it. Chayton said quietly that we should ride on. He was not a coward. He had counted coup 3 times before his 25th year, and he had sat with me through things that would freeze a lesser man to the spot. But he was practical in the way that comes from watching a great many situations go wrong. 6 armed men with a head start and no reason to welcome us were not something to ride toward on a summer afternoon with no plan and no reinforcements, particularly when their business looked like the kind of business that didn't want witnesses. I was about to say he was right. I was already forming the word in my mouth. And then I heard the sound. It came from the grass on the east side of the road, below the shallow cutbank that the spring floods had carved out over years of high water running fast. A small sound. Not a cry, not a call for help, something smaller than that, the kind of sound a person makes when they have decided very firmly not to make any sounds and then failed at it briefly, for just a moment, before pulling themselves back under control. The sound of someone trying to be invisible and losing the grip on their breathing for one instant. I rode to the edge of the cutbank and looked down. She was wedged into the lowest part of the cut, where the clay overhang came out farthest and gave the best cover from the road. She was pressed against the earth like she was trying to become part of it, her hands flat against the clay wall, her knees drawn up. Her dress white, elaborate, the kind worn once for a ceremony and never again in the ordinary run of life, was torn at the shoulder and streaked with mud from the bank, the white gone ivory and gray with it. Her hair had come half down from wherever it had been pinned, some of it loose around her shoulders and some of it still caught in the pins that remained. She had blood on her left hand, dried already, going brown, from a cut across the palm that had bled enough to run into the creases of her fingers, and then dried there. She was looking up at me with eyes that were deciding something very fast. I did not move toward her. I sat my horse at the edge of the bank and let her look. Let her see my face, my hands where they were, on the saddle horn and nowhere near anything that could be a threat. I let her take the time she needed. I had learned a long time ago, from necessity, from the experience of having been on the receiving end of the fear that strange men provoke in a dangerous country, that a frightened person needed a moment to read you before they could hear anything you said. Move too fast and they hear nothing. Their whole mind is on the movement and the calculation it sets off. Be still and they start to listen. They start to take in the information that is actually in front of them rather than the threat they are braced for. She looked at me for what felt like a full minute, longer maybe. Then she looked at Chayton and at Motto behind him, reading them both. Then she looked back at me. She said, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be given what was around her and what she was sitting in, "Are you going to hurt me?" I said no. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said, "The men who did this, they work for my husband." I looked at the burning wagon. The lacquered wood had mostly caught by now, the good craftsmanship of it going up as readily as any other wood once the paint had done its work. The brass fittings glowed orange in the heat, the fanciness of them not protecting them from anything. An expensive fire. Someone had wanted to make a point or send a message or both. I said, "Your husband set fire to your wagon." She said, "My husband set fire to my wagon on my wedding day, yes, because I told him I wouldn't sign the deed transfer." She paused, just a breath's worth, the pause of someone organizing their thoughts rather than losing them. "The deed is in my name. My father left it to me in my name, and if I sign it over, I have nothing left. He knows that. He's known it since before he asked me to marry him." Another pause, shorter. "I figured that out about 3 hours ago." Motto made a sound behind me, not quite a laugh, something between admiration and disbelief. I looked at the road going west, at the 6 sets of hoofprints already beginning to blur in the afternoon wind. Then I looked back down at her. I said, "Can you ride?" She looked at her left hand, turned it over, looked at the palm, flexed the fingers one at a time, said yes. I got down off my horse and went to the edge of the bank and held my hand out to her. She took it, her grip was firm, the cut palm and all, no flinching from using it, and I pulled her up out of the cut. It took some effort. The clay was soft enough that her feet kept finding no purchase, but she worked with me rather than just hanging there, pushing off where she could, and we got her up onto the road and she stood in the dust and looked at the burning wagon for a moment without saying anything. The right rear corner of it collapsed inward with a sound like a sigh, and a little shower of sparks went up and drifted south in the light wind. She watched that, and then she looked at me. She said, "Where are we going?" I said, "Somewhere those men won't follow." She considered that. She looked at me, then at Chayton, then at Motto, reading all 3 of us again, more thoroughly this time. The wind moved the tall grass on both sides of the road with a sound like water. Somewhere to the south, one of the wagon's axles gave way in the heat and the whole structure shifted and settled lower, and another spray of sparks went up, bigger this time. She said, "All right." That was how it started, not with ceremony, not with planning or introduction or any of the things that are supposed to precede the beginning of something. A woman in a ruined white dress deciding to trust a stranger on a road, because all her other options had just caught fire 50 feet away. Her name was Elspeth Crane. She told me that an hour into the ride north, when we stopped to water the horses at Crow Creek and give the animals a rest from the afternoon heat. She said it plainly, like a fact she was putting down on a table, not introducing herself exactly, not performing a social ritual, more like establishing a record for someone she expected to need it later. Elspeth Crane. She had been Elspeth Crane her entire life, and she had every intention of remaining so. I told her my name. In Lakota first, which is the name that matters and the one that has meaning, and then the name the traders and the agents and the county clerks used, which is the one that fits in other people's mouths without requiring them to learn anything. Standing elk. She said both versions carefully, getting the sounds of the Lakota right, not rushing through it to get to the familiar one, not performing respect, actually trying. There is a difference, and you can hear it. People who are performing the gesture move through it quickly, the motion more important to them than the sounds. People who are actually trying slow down and listen to themselves and start again if it comes out wrong. She started again twice. Then she had it. We rode on. The creek country in that part of the territory was still green that time of year, or as close to green as it got that summer, the grass along the water staying ahead of the drought, while the higher ground went brittle. Cottonwoods thick along the bends, their leaves turning silver side up in the wind, and the water itself running clear over a gravel bed about 10 inches deep, shallow enough that the horses waded it without bothering to drink it first, just cooling their legs. Then they settled and drank, and we let them. Elspeth sat on her horse in the water and looked upstream. She had settled herself on the gray mare, Motto's backup horse, a solid and calm animal that he had spent 2 years teaching to be unimpressed by things that most horses found alarming, with the ease of someone for whom a horse was an ordinary tool rather than an occasional one. Her back was straight, and her hands were quiet on the reins, and the mare had made up her mind about Elspeth somewhere in the first half hour, and had been perfectly cooperative ever since. Animals read people the same way people do, I have always thought, only faster and with fewer second thoughts. The wedding dress had dried somewhat in the afternoon sun, and was stiff at the hem where the mud had crusted. She had pinned the torn shoulder back together with 2 pins that had still been in her hair. She hadn't mentioned it, and I hadn't mentioned it, and it stayed mentioned by neither of us. We made camp that first night on a bench of ground above the creek, back in the pines where the rock shelf kept the cold of the ground from rising up at you the way it does on open land. Chayton built the fire small and set it back under the overhang of a limestone shelf, so the light wouldn't carry to the road or the ridgeline. Motto had the horses picketed where the grass was good. I gave Elspeth my extra blanket, a trade blanket, Hudson's Bay wool, heavy enough to mean something, the kind that keeps the wind off rather than just pretending to, and she wrapped it around her shoulders over the dress and sat close to the small fire and ate the dried meat and corn cakes we had with her without complaint and without making a production of the plainness of it. She asked me about the country, how far to the nearest town, how far to the agency, what the relations were between the ranchers in this part of the territory and the Lakota bands, whether the men who had set fire to her wagon were the kind who would come looking when they didn't find what they were looking for. I answered each question straight and complete. The nearest town was 2 days south, which was not a direction we were heading. The agency was further. The relations in this part of the territory were complicated in the way that all such relations were complicated, which is to say, layered and particular, shaped by individual personalities and specific histories, not easily summarized. And yes, the men who had burned the wagon would come looking. Not out of love or even anger, I doubted either of those were in the calculation, but because of the deed she'd mentioned, the land she hadn't signed away. A man who marries a woman for her property doesn't stop wanting the property because the wedding didn't take. The property is still there. The wanting doesn't change because the ceremony did. She nodded at each answer. The way a person nods when they're filing information rather than reacting to it. the small economical nod of someone who is building a picture and adding to it one piece at a time. Then I asked her about the deed, what land, how much, where. She told me her father had left her 3 sections of bottomland east of the Niobrara. Good grass, she said, good water all year, the kind of ground a cattleman would consider valuable, and anyone paying attention to what was under the grass might consider more valuable still. She had been running cattle on it herself for 2 years since her father's death, with 2 hired men she trusted who had worked for her father before her. She knew the operation well. She had learned it alongside him from the time she was old enough to follow him on horseback, and when he died she had taken up the management of it without anyone needing to tell her how. The man she'd almost married, a man named Holt Beaumont, from Omaha, with money that came from investments he described in broad and general terms and never specifics, had come to her county 8 months before. He had presented himself as a businessman looking to diversify into western land and cattle, had met Elspeth through a series of introductions that now, in retrospect, she recognized as having been arranged rather than accidental. He had courted her with patience and attention, and the particular kind of consideration that flatters a woman who is used to doing everything herself, and he had proposed in a public enough setting that all the people around her, her father's old friends, her aunt who lived 2 counties east, the county judge who handled her father's estate, the minister who had baptized her as an infant, had all said yes before she had time to think clearly about whether she was saying it herself. She said the first time she felt something was wrong was when the prenuptial papers arrived from Beaumont's lawyer, and the deed transfer was buried on page 9, worded in language that would have looked like standard boilerplate to someone who wasn't reading carefully. She said the second time was when she crossed out page 9 and initialed the deletion and handed the papers back to the lawyer, and the lawyer looked at the crossed-out page and looked at her and didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't explain, didn't try to convince her, just took the papers and left, and she understood in that moment that the argument wasn't coming because it wasn't needed. They were going to get the land one way or another, papers signed or not, and the wedding was not the point of any of it. She told me all of this in the firelight, sitting cross-legged on the ground with the blanket around her shoulders, speaking in the level and organized tone of a woman who was angry but was not letting the anger drive the telling. The facts first, the implications after, the conclusions only when she'd built to them honestly. I watched her while she talked. I had been watching her since the cut bank, but more carefully now in the light with time. She was 30, maybe 32. The kind of face that had been outside in all weather, the weather in the skin, the fine lines at the corners of the eyes from squinting into sun, the slight weathering at the jaw and forehead that outdoor work puts on a person. Her hands, even the cut one, were not the hands of a woman who had spent her adult life indoors. She had been running land by herself for 2 years, and the evidence of it was in her. Whatever Beaumont had thought he was getting when he looked at a widow rancher's daughter in a frontier county and saw an opportunity, he had read the surface and missed the substance. That was his mistake, and it had cost him a clean plan. Chayton had fallen asleep with his hat over his face, one hand resting on his chest, breathing slow and easy. Motto was on watch at the outer edge of the camp, quiet as he always was, a shape in the dark between the pine trunks. The fire had burned down to coals. Elspeth said, without looking up from the coals, "You haven't asked me what I want to do." I said I figured she'd tell me when she was ready. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the coals, which had gone from orange to the deep red that comes just before they go gray. She said, "I want to go back to my land. My cattle are there. My hired men, 2 of them, Dix and Amos, good men both, they'll have no word from me and they'll be scared or confused or both. I want to know they're all right." She paused. "And I want to make it plain to Holt Beaumont that I am not dead in a ditch somewhere and not about to become so, and that the deed is mine and will remain mine, and that if he sends more men to change that fact there will be consequences he has not planned for." I said that was a reasonable set of things to want. She said, "Can you help me with any of them?" I looked at the coals for a moment. I thought about the country between here and the Niobrara. I thought about Beaumont's 6 men, and about what kind of man sets fire to a wedding wagon with a woman in the grass 50 feet away, and about what kind of men he would hire to carry out an instruction like that. I thought about what I had available, and about what I owed, and about what I chose. I said, I can. She said, why? It was a fair question, a direct one, the kind that deserved a real answer rather than a short one. I took a breath and I said, because I have seen what happens to women in this territory when men with money and lawyers decide that something belongs to them. I have seen it happen to women of my own people, in ways that the law did not acknowledge and the courts did not address, and the agents recorded in careful neutral language that described the outcome without naming the wrong. And I have seen it happen to white women too, different circumstances, different legal machinery, the same mathematics underneath. Someone decides something is theirs and the systems around them agree, and a woman ends up with nothing, or with worse than nothing. And I am in a position to make that not happen to this one woman on this one piece of land, and so I will do that. Because I can. Because I choose to. Because the right thing and the possible thing are the same thing tonight, and that is not so common that I am going to ride past it. She listened to all of that without moving, without nodding, without making the small sounds people make to show they're following. Just listening, the way you listen when you are actually taking something in. Then she said, that's the most I've heard you say at once. I said it tended to come out when I had something worth saying. She looked at me across the fire, looked at me long enough that it was not a casual look, not a social glance. She was reading me the same way she'd read me on the cutbank, with the same attention, building up a picture from the evidence in front of her rather than from any preconception she'd carried in. She said, I believe you. She said it simply, like a fact she was adding to the record. I said, good, sleep. We ride early. She said, all right, and she lay down on her side on the blanket with her knees drawn up against the cool of the night, and she was asleep before the coals went fully gray. We rode for 3 days to reach her land. In that time I learned the shape of how she thought, which is a thing you can learn about a person if you ride beside them long enough through varied country and let the hours do the work. The way she organized her attention, the ranch first, the specific and immediate safety of her hired men, and then the legal question, and then Beaumont in that order, and she didn't let any layer contaminate the one below it. She thought in the order of what could actually be addressed, not the order of what felt most urgent. I had met very few people who could do that under pressure, hold the structure of a problem steady while the problem was still active and frightening. She also knew when she'd reached the edge of what thinking could do and needed information instead. When she got there, she'd say so and ask a direct question and take in the answer without filtering it through what she'd hoped to hear. No self-deception in it, or very little. Very little was probably all you could ask of anyone. The first day was easy country, Crow Creek and its tributaries, land I knew well enough to navigate in the dark if I had to. Good cover in the creek bottoms, adequate water, nobody on the trails but us and the wildlife that watched us pass and decided we weren't worth fleeing from. A pair of antelope stood on a low ridge and watched us go by at 50 yards, and a great blue heron rose from a backwater pond ahead of us and made its slow prehistoric way upstream, complaining about the interruption in its flat grating voice. The day had the quality that dry summer days have in that country when the previous day's rain has cleaned the air and the drought hasn't had time to reassert itself yet. The sky was clean to the edges and the light had a particular crispness to it, everything at a slightly greater definition than usual, the grass heads distinct against the sky, the red rock showing bright where it broke through the soil on the higher ground. I had spent 30 years in this country, and I still noticed that quality of light when it came, the way a person notices something they have learned to expect and haven't learned to take for granted. Elspeth rode the gray mare and rode it the way I'd already assessed, easy and competent, no wasted motion, her weight balanced without effort and her hands quiet on the reins. The mare had made her peace with Elspeth in the first hour, and by now they moved like a pair that had been together for some time, the horse reading her rider's intention before the intention fully formed into a command. That's something you either have or you don't, the quality that makes animals trust you, and she had it. That first morning she was quiet, which I respected. There is a kind of quiet that is the product of shock or numbness, the silence of someone whose mind has gone to a place that isn't accessible from outside, and there is a kind of quiet that is the product of thinking, of working something through in the way that works for that particular person. Hers was the second kind. I could see it in the way her eyes moved across the country, taking it in, noting things, the way a rancher's eyes move across land, assessing. She was working. She was doing the thing she did, which was to look at what she had and figure out what to do with it. By mid-morning, she was ready to talk again. She asked me about the country we were passing through, not just the geography, the names of things, but the history of it, what it had been and what it was now, and what she was likely to encounter as she moved through it. She asked the way a person asks who is building a map rather than making conversation. She wanted the real information, the practical kind, and she took it in and filed it in the right place, and occasionally asked a follow-up question that showed she'd been listening precisely. I told her about the creek country and the high plains above it. I told her which of the agents in the territory were honest men trying to do an impossible job badly designed, and which were men who had come to take what they could take while the opportunity lasted. I told her what the summers had been like for 5 years running, the weather and the grass, and the way the drought had moved through like something with a purpose. I told her which of the ranchers in the area south of the Niobrara she could trust, and which she couldn't, on the basis of what I'd seen, and what I'd been told by people whose judgment I respected. She said halfway through that last part, "How do you know which ranchers to trust? What's the tell?" I said the tell was how they behaved when it cost them something to behave rightly. When it was easy to be honest, a lot of men were honest. When it was expensive, you found out what they were actually made of. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said that was a useful measuring stick, and she was going to apply it to her own memory of the men in her county. We were quiet for a while after that. The grass moved in the wind, and the sky went from blue to the particular deep blue it gets at midday in the high summer, the color of something without a bottom to it. She said eventually, "What do you make of Beaumont, from what I've told you?" I said I made a man who did his thinking ahead of time and didn't adjust well when the thinking was wrong. The wedding day move, the fire, the violence of it, that was the action of a man whose plan had been disrupted and who had reached for the thing closest to hand, which was force. A careful man would have waited. A truly careful man would have found a subtler way. Burning the wagon was the action of someone who had relied on the plan working and didn't have a good second plan ready when it didn't. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That matches what I saw at the end when I handed the papers back. He didn't get angry, which I expected. He went very still, and then he left the room." She paused. I've been trying to figure out what that stillness meant, whether it was control or whether it was recalculating. I said both, probably. Control in the moment, recalculating immediately after. She said, "That's what I thought." She paused again, shorter. "That means whatever he does next will be more careful than the wagon." I said that was how I read it too. She said, "Good. Better to know." That first afternoon I had a long and careful conversation with Chayton while we rode, Motto leading the way and Elspeth ahead of us both, out of range of our voices. Chayton laid out the logic with his characteristic thoroughness, the same thoroughness that had made him the person I trusted most in a situation that required clear thinking. He said, "Beaumont's men know we were on that road or near it. If anyone saw us at the burning wagon, a rider passing, a farmer in a field, anyone, they know roughly what direction we headed. 6 men with rifles and a money trail behind them are not adversaries to take lightly, And if the county law is in Beaumont's pocket, which it might be, for a man with that kind of reach and patience, we could be heading into something more complicated than a straightforward property dispute. He asked me what I was planning in the specific terms of who and what and when. I told him. He listened to all of it in the way he always did, not interrupting, turning it over. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at the trail ahead. And then he said, "Yes, all right, we will do that." Chayton had known me for 20 years, since we were both young men with the same good intentions and insufficient experience. When he said all right to something like this, he meant it all the way down, no reservation held in reserve. I trusted that completely. That evening we came to the summer camp of my cousin Lakota and his family. He was my mother's sister's son, older than me by 6 years, a man of the same careful and unhurried quality as my mother's family in general, which made him a good thinker and an occasionally exasperating conversationalist if you were in a hurry. 3 lodges were set back from a small creek in a coulee where the willows were thick enough to muffle the firelight, and the smoke had time to dissipate before it reached the open sky above the coulee walls. Lakota came out to meet us when he heard the horses. He saw Elspeth, registered her presence with one long neutral look, and then looked at me with the expression I knew well, a calm question in it, no accusation, no alarm, just the inquiry of a man who wanted to understand what he was looking at before he said anything about it. I explained briefly. The wagon, the fire, the deed, the 6 men. Lakota listened and then nodded once and turned and spoke to his wife, who came to the lodge door and looked at Elspeth with the same direct inventory Lakota had given her, and then nodded and went back inside and came out with a bundle of clothing. She held it out to Elspeth, a deerskin dress worn soft with use, and a pair of moccasins that were close enough to Elspeth's size to be workable. Elspeth took them with her hands and her whole attention, the way you take something when you actually need it and know you do. She looked at the moccasins closely, the stitching, the particular way the sole was attached, and she said something about the workmanship that was specific rather than general. Lakota's wife, who spoke no English, read the attention and the tone of it and understood them exactly, because that is the universal language of someone who recognizes skill, and she nodded and allowed herself a slight pleased expression and went back to her fire. We ate with Lakota's family that evening. It was a good meal, the kind of meal a camp produces when the summer has been decent and the women have had time to put things up properly. There was dried meat in a broth with wild turnip, and fry bread, and chokecherries that had been dried and pounded and mixed with fat in the old way. Elspeth ate what she was given without performing gratitude and without performing discomfort, the same even attention she brought to everything, and Lakota's wife, whose name was Zitkala, which means bird, which suited her sharp eyes and quick movements, watched her the way women watch strangers in their home, taking inventory, and seemed to conclude that the inventory was acceptable. Elspeth helped clean up after the meal without being asked. She didn't make a show of it. She just saw what needed doing and did it, which was apparently sufficient for Zitkala, who after that treated her with the particular warmth Zitkala reserved for people who were useful without needing to announce it. After the meal, when the women and the younger children had moved inside and the older boys had drifted off to their own fire and Mato had gone to check on the horses, I sat with Lakota and Chayton by the main fire and told Lakota the full story. Not the compressed version I'd given him at the gate, but all of it, the burning wagon, the cut palm, the 6 sets of hoofprints going west, the deed and page 9 and what Beaumont had been building for 8 months. The coal survey, the county clerk, the particular kind of legal machinery that could be set in motion against a woman alone if she disappeared at the right moment. Lakota listened with his hands around his cup and his eyes on the fire, and he didn't interrupt, and he didn't ask for clarification until I'd finished. Then he was quiet for a while. He turned his cup in his hands, he looked at the fire. He said, "The coal." I said, "Yes." He said, "Under her land." I said that was what the survey indicated possibly. The survey was preliminary. He said, "They never come this far out of Omaha for cattle." He said it not bitterly, not dramatically, the way you state a thing you have watched long enough to accept as simple fact. Cattle is something they already have. It's always what's underneath. I said I knew. He said, "And the county clerk is his." I said, "Probably." He sat with that. The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted, and the sound of hooves on ground came and went. He said, finally, "You're going to need more than 3 men." I said I was going to need 4, for a week, if he could spare them. Men who knew the Niobrara country. He thought about it. He thought the way he always thought, not performing the process, not running through it visibly, just going somewhere quiet inside it and coming back when he'd arrived at the answer. It took the time it took. I sat and waited, and Chayton sat and waited, both of us having known Lakota long enough to know that what he said when he came back out of the thinking would be worth the wait. He said he had 4 men. He named them. I knew 2 of the names, and Chayton knew all 4. He said they knew the Niobrara country from the bluffs to the eastern tributaries. He said they were not trouble seekers, but they were equally not men who got frightened when trouble arrived at them, and they could tell the difference between the 2 situations, which was the thing that mattered most. He offered them the way he would offer anything that was his to offer, not as a weight being placed on a scale, not as a display of generosity, not as a debt being created between us. Just as the thing that was needed, from a man who had it to give. We had been riding beside each other in one form or another since before I was chief, and he was father of a household, since we were both young men who thought the world would turn out differently than it did, and in all that time, the currency between us had never been debt or favor. It had been something simpler and more durable than that. I said I was grateful. He said, "Don't be grateful. Bring them back in one piece." And he looked at me with one corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the particular expression he had for situations that were serious, and also, underneath, faintly absurd in the way that situations involving the behavior of men with money always were, and I said I intended to. Chayton said to Lakota before we turned in that it was good country up here, that the cottonwoods along the creek looked healthy. Lakota said the creek had held better than the others he knew of. Chayton said that was something. And then we let the fire go down and slept. Outside the camp the prairie went on in every direction, dark and large and indifferent, which was not the same as uncaring. It just cared about different things than we did. The second day we rode faster. The extra 4 men from Lakota's camp made us feel different in the open country, not a pair of travelers anymore, but something with weight to it, something that had made a decision. Elspeth asked me, around the middle of the morning, about my life. Not cautiously, not with the careful framing people sometimes use when they are afraid of asking the wrong thing and want to stay clearly on the polite side of the line. Directly. She said she'd been talking about herself and her situation for most of the time she'd known me, and she'd been doing all the asking, and that seemed unbalanced. So I told her. I told her about my wife, who had been dead 8 years from a fever that came through in the early spring and took people without any particular logic, the old and the young and the healthy and the already sick in no distinguishable pattern. Her name had been Winona, which I will say here because she deserves to be named. She had been 31 when she died, and she had been, in the particular way of a person you have lived beside for years and paid close daily attention to, extraordinary in the ordinary things. The way she handled her horses, the way she listened, the way she was funny in the dry and quiet way that took a moment to land and was better for it. I had grieved her in the way a man grieves something that was the center of his daily life, which is to say, badly at first and then less badly and then not recovered exactly but restructured, the way a tree grows around a wound. Elspeth listened to that without filling the space where Winona was with words or sympathy. She just let it be said. I told her about my son, Takota's namesake, 14 years old and at the agency school, because that was where the world that was coming, whether I wanted it or not, whether I considered it just or not, kept its tools. I wanted him to have those tools. I wanted him to be able to move through the world as it was actually going to be, not only as it should have been. But I also wanted him to know what he was and where he came from and what that meant. And the tension between those two wants was something I lived with every day without resolving it, because it was not the kind of thing that got resolved. It got carried. I told her about my brother, who had died in one of the small engagements of the mid-70s that the newspapers called battles, and named after the creeks they occurred near and that we called, simply, losses. He had been 26. He had been a better rider than me and a worse shot, and a better singer than either of those things would suggest. I missed him in the specific way you miss someone whose particular way of doing everything ordinary is what you miss. His voice, the sound of him eating, the specific stupid joke he made whenever we rode through a certain kind of flat country. Things that don't get captured in a memory of a person, but that make up most of what the person actually was. She listened to all of this. She asked questions, specific, careful questions, the kind that showed she had been following closely. She asked what my son's name was and what it meant. She asked what my father had taught me about leading people. I said my father had told me, a chief's job is not to tell his people what to do. It is to see clearly what is happening and to put himself between his people and the thing that is going to harm them. The leadership is in the placement, not the instruction. You put yourself in the right position, and then you do what the position requires. She rode beside me for a moment after that, the horses walking at an easy pace, the morning going warm around us. She said, "Is that what you're doing with me? Placing yourself between something and the harm?" I said it was a version of it. That sometimes you placed yourself between your people and the harm, and sometimes you placed yourself between a woman in a cutbank and the men who had put her there, and the action was the same even if the circumstances were different. She said, "I'm not your people." I said, "No, but you're a person, and I was in the right position, and the position required action." She considered that. The trail curved where the bluff did, and the creek showed below us through a gap in the cottonwoods, running silver over the stones. She said quietly, not looking at me, "I don't know many men who operate that way." I said there were more of them than she might think. She said, "I'm not so sure." On the second afternoon, the weather changed. The sky that had been clear and dry for 2 days went gray at the western edge first, then gray all the way across, a flat pewter lid settling down from above. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in less than an hour. The horses felt it before we did. They got quieter, more attentive, flicking their ears. The smell of the air changed from dry grass and sage to something that had water in it coming from a long way off. By late afternoon it was raining. Not hard, a steady, cold, persistent rain that came straight down in the windless air and found every gap in your clothing and worked its way to your skin over the course of an hour. It had the quality of a fall rain that had arrived too early, the kind that comes in August to remind you what October feels like and doesn't apologize for the interruption. We made poor time in the wet, picking our way along a creek that had gone from clear to brown as the runoff came in, and we found shelter in the ruins of a trading post that had been abandoned long enough that the roof had fallen in on the western end, but the eastern 3 walls still stood, and enough of the roof remained over that section to keep the rain off a fire and the people tending it. The horses were out of the wet under a limestone overhang 50 yards away, Motto with them, his preference on a watch night being to be with the horses rather than with people. Chayton got the fire going with the dry wood from under the limestone shelf where someone or something had stacked it, or it had ended up there naturally, sheltered from the damp. We had enough supplies for the night. Motto had shot a prairie chicken in the last hour of light, and we had that bird on a stick over the coals, and the smell of it was, in the circumstances, about as good a smell as there was. Elspeth had been quiet for the last 2 hours of the ride. Not the thinking quiet of the morning, a different kind. I watched her at the fire while she ate her portion of the bird, the firelight moving on her face, and the look she had was the look of a person sitting with something they've been avoiding and finding it still there when they stop moving. When she'd set the bone down, she sat for a while with her hands around her tin cup of water, looking into the fire, and then she said, "I need to tell you something about the land, about why Beaumont wants it the way he does." I said, "Go on." She said it wasn't only the grass and the water, though both were good and worth having. 2 years before her father's death, a government survey crew had come through the eastern sections of the Niobrara country. Standard stuff, or so they'd said, boundary survey, land assessment, the usual federal work that moved through the territory every few years. Her father had spoken with the crew's lead man over several days, and had gotten enough out of him to understand that the assessment had turned up something interesting. The coal seams that were known to run through the northern counties of the territory might. And this was speculative. The survey man had been careful to say speculative. Extend south into the land along the Niobrara's eastern tributaries. Her father's sections sat squarely in the zone that the survey man had been most interested in. Her father had told no one. He had told her because he told her everything eventually, but no one else, because he was a man who understood that land values transform when people start speculating about what's underneath, and that transformation is never orderly and rarely benefits the person who already owns the land. She said she believed Beaumont had gotten access to the Survey Bureau's preliminary findings. She didn't know how, paid for them, or knew someone who had, but she believed he had seen what her father had seen, and had understood what it meant, and had come to her county, specifically because of what her land might be sitting on top of. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the rain came down steady, and even on the ruined roof over our heads, drumming on what remained of the shingles. I said, "Then the 6 men on the road aren't the full extent of what he's willing to do." She said no, they were the first move when the plan went sideways. The real move will come through the courts, or through the county records, or through some legal mechanism I haven't predicted yet. She paused. If I disappear, if I'm declared dead, or if he can get a petition in front of a sympathetic judge claiming I'm incompetent or absent, the land goes into probate, and from there to wherever his lawyers can steer it. Nobody in that county has the reach or the will to stop it once it's in motion. Chayton looked at me from across the fire. I looked at the coals. I said, "Then we need to move faster than I planned." She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for the last 2 hours." I looked at her across the fire, the deerskin dress, the hair down and drying in the heat from the fire, the left hand with the cut on it, the wound closing now, the dried blood going dark. The expression on her face, which was not afraid, which was measuring distances and laying out the next moves in sequence. I said, "Have you figured out how?" She said, "Partly, but it requires me trusting you with something." I said that seemed fair. She looked at me, and there was a moment where she made a decision. I could see it, not in any dramatic fashion, just in the slight settling of something that had been held a little tense. She said there was a second copy of the deed. Her father had made one. It was not at the county recorder's office, and it was not at the ranch. It was in a lockbox at a bank in Yankton, under her father's name, with her name on the authorization list. The bank manager was a man named Gruber who had known her father for 30 years. He was old and careful, and he had no reason to speak to Beaumont or Beaumont's people, and as far as she knew, Beaumont had no way of knowing the box existed. I said, "How long to get to Yankton and back?" She said, 4 days if we push, maybe 3.5. I thought about that, about the 6 men going west, about how long before they turned around when they'd gone far enough to find nothing and came back looking, about Dix and Amos on her land with no word from her and no way to know what was happening. I said, we go to your land first. We make sure your men are safe. We make sure Beaumont doesn't already have people on your ground. Then 2 of us ride to Yankton and 2 stay. Chayton said from the shadow at the edge of the fire, I'll go to Yankton. I said I would go with him. Elspeth looked at me. She started to say something and then stopped, reconsidered. She said, all right, that's the plan. Outside the rain kept coming. Motto had come in from the horses and settled himself against the wall at the end where the fire's warmth reached best, and he was asleep by the time we'd finished talking. Chayton was sharpening a knife with a small piece of whetstone, the sound of it even and steady. I sat by the fire after Elspeth lay down, and I watched the dark past the edge of the standing walls and thought about the next few days. Thought about all the ways they could go wrong and what we would need for each kind of wrong. Not worry exactly, not the spinning kind, the productive kind, the preparation kind. Going through it while there was still time to think about it. The rain kept coming. Somewhere out in the dark one of the horses shifted and Motto, asleep, made a small sound, already tracking the sound even in sleep. He was like that. Some men are. I sat there until the fire was low, and then I lay down and slept. We reached the boundary of her land on the afternoon of the 3rd day. I knew it before she said anything because the grass changed. Not the species of it, the same mix of bluestem and grama as the surrounding country, but the management of it, the pattern of it. Grazed in a rotation, the near sections rested while the far sections fed the herd, so that the grass on the rested ground was standing tall and the ground where the cattle were was cropped down evenly. You can see it from horseback when you know what you're looking at. Her father had been a good cattleman, and she had continued what he'd built, and the land showed it. She stopped her horse at the rise that looked east across the long shallow valley that the upper creek drained, and I stopped beside her. Below us, maybe 2 miles, the ranch building sat in a cluster against a cottonwood grove along the creek. The main house, low and solid-looking with a covered porch, a barn that had been built to last, 2 outbuildings, the pole corrals with cattle in them and more in the pastures beyond. Everything looked intact from this distance. No smoke except what came from the cookhouse chimney, thin and white in the afternoon air. No unusual movement in the yard. The corrals were full enough that the cattle were there and hadn't been moved or scattered. Elspeth let out a breath. Long and slow, the breath of someone releasing a tension they'd been holding without being aware of it. She said Dix's horse is in the near corral. The brown with the blaze, that's his. I said that was good. She said if Beaumont had men here and something had gone wrong, that horse wouldn't be standing there calm. Dix would have moved it, or it would have been taken. I said, let's go down. We came down off the rise at an easy pace in the open, no cover sought. No point in sneaking up on your own land, and I wanted anyone watching from the buildings to have plenty of time to see us and decide what we were and what we weren't. About a 1/4 mile from the gate, a man came out of the barn. He came into the yard and stopped and shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun behind us, looking at the group of us. Then he started walking toward the gate, not running but moving fast, the walk of a man who has made up his mind that he needs to be closer to what he's looking at before he decides what to do about it. He was wiry and bow-legged, somewhere around 50, with the deep tan of someone whose face has been outside in every season for 30 years. He had a knife on his belt and his hand went near it and then stopped when Elspeth said, "Dix, it's me. Don't do anything stupid." He stopped in his tracks. He looked at her in the deerskin dress, her hair still down, on a horse he didn't know, and he looked at me and the men behind me, and something moved across his face that was complicated and settled eventually into relief, so large it was almost pain. He said, and his voice was rough with something that wasn't anger at all, "Miss Crane, Lord, we didn't know what happened. They told us at the church. Someone came and said there'd been an accident. They said the wagon." He stopped, swallowed. "We didn't know what to believe." She said, "I know, Dix, I'm here. Is Amos all right?" He said Amos was inside with a bad ankle from a fall 2 days back. Nothing broken, but it had swollen up and he'd been keeping off it. He said the cattle were fine. The hands had been keeping up with the usual work. And he said there had been men on the south boundary. 3 of them the first time, just sitting their horses on the road and watching the ranch yard. He'd ridden out and asked their business, and they'd said they were passing through, though you didn't pass through the south road if you were going anywhere in particular. He told them there was nothing to see here and to move on, and they had, but they'd been back the next morning with the same story, and he'd gone out again that time with his rifle across the saddle, and they'd moved on faster. Elspeth said, "They'll be back." Dick said he figured. She said, "There will be more of them next time, and they'll have legal papers of some kind. We need to be ready for that." She told him what had happened. Most of it, the wagon, the fire, the ride north, the deed and Beaumont's design and the coal survey. Dix listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the set of it getting tighter as she went on. When she was finished, he looked at the south road for a moment. He said flatly, "You should have shot him at the church." She said, "I thought about it." He said, "You'd have been acquitted." She said, "I know, come inside." Lakota's 4 men made camp in the near pasture, by the creek that ran along the property's south edge. They had everything they needed and they set it up efficiently, the work of men who were used to moving camp. But their presence was visible from the road and intended to be 8 horses, men moving about, fires at dusk. Not a display of force exactly, more a display of fact. There were people on this land and they were not going anywhere. And a man riding by and counting horses and cooking fires would have a different calculation to make before he decided on an approach. I helped Amos with his ankle that afternoon. I had learned something about binding injuries from a healer in my mother's band, the direction of the wrapping, the tension, the way it was supposed to hold without cutting the blood off, and Amos sat on his bunk and let me work and didn't say much. He was a younger man than Dix, mid-30s, with careful and observant eyes. When I was nearly finished, he said, without making a particular production of it, "She trusts you." I said, "She trusts herself. She's borrowing some ground to stand on." He thought about that for a moment. He said, "That's fair." That evening, Elspeth cooked in the ranch kitchen and put a meal on the table for everyone who was in the yard, which was the 4 of us who'd ridden down, and the 2 who were already there and 2 of Lakota's men who happened to be passing the house at the right moment. It was a plain meal, the kind you cook fast when there are mouths to fill and no time for ceremony, beans and salt pork and cornbread, the thing you can make from what you have in quantity. But it was done right, the cornbread with some sweetness in it, the beans cooked long enough to be creamy rather than hard. She put a plate in front of me last and then sat down across the table, not at the head of it, but in the middle, where she could see everyone and everyone could see her. She said, to the table in general, in the calm and level voice she used when she was about to say something she'd already decided, "Tomorrow, I need 2 people to ride to Yankton with me." I looked at her. She had changed it from what we'd planned. She was going herself. I said, "We agreed you'd stay here while Chayton and I." She said, "I know what we agreed. I reconsidered it." She met my eyes directly. "The deed has my name on it. The bank knows my face. If anything goes wrong at the bank, any wrinkle, any question, any reason the notary hesitates, I need to be there to resolve it. You can't do that. It has to be me." I looked at her. She looked back. Around the table, nobody said anything, and nobody ate waiting. I said, "Then I go with you. Chayton stays here with Dix and Amos and the others." She said, "Agreed." Dix said, "Beaumont's men on the south road." She said, "We'll see 7 men on this property and think twice about whatever they were planning. That's enough." Dick started to say something else and stopped when she looked at him. She said, "Dix, have I made a bad call since I took over this operation?" He was quiet, then he said, "No." She said, "Then trust me." He said, "All right." He said it the same way Chayton had said it to me, with the full weight of a man who means what he says. We left before light the next morning, just the two of us. We went north first, across the upper end of her property where the land was still dark and the dew was heavy on the grass, and then swung east on the bluff trail that ran above the Niobrara. The river was low and silver in the first light, running quiet in its wide summer bed, and the bluffs above it were going pale gold as the sun came up behind us. She set the pace. She knew these trails and I let her lead, which was right. I was in her country now. The first few hours were mostly quiet, each of us in our own thoughts, the horses finding their footing in the trail and the morning. I was thinking about the distance and the time and what we might find at the bank and what we might find when we came back, running through the possibilities and the contingencies. She was doing something similar, I guessed, from the set of her shoulders. But around mid-morning she said, without looking at me, "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the right thing and the possible thing being the same thing and not walking away from it." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I've met very few people who operate that way, who think about what they're able to do and what's right and treat those two things as connected." I said, "Most people do in small things." She said, "But not in large ones." I said, "Not always." She said, "Why do you?" I thought about it. I said, I had learned from watching what happens when people don't, when they separate the question of what they can do from the question of what they should, and let themselves off the hook by saying the situation was beyond them or not their problem. I had watched that happen with the land, with the treaties, with the agency agreements. Men who could have acted differently, choosing not to, and then constructing reasons why the choice was inevitable. I had watched it enough to understand very clearly what it looked like, and to decide I didn't want to be an example of it. She rode beside me for a while thinking about that. She said, "That's a harder way to live." I said it was sometimes. She said, "It's also a more honest one." I didn't say anything to that. She said, "I'm going to think about that for a long time, what you said." Yankton was a proper town by then, brick on the main streets, a hotel with 3 stories and a painted sign, a courthouse with the territorial flag and the national one. I had been there on agency business several times, and I knew how I read to people on those sidewalks. Noticed, watched, occasionally moved around, the subtle and constant renavigation of a man who is seen as being in the wrong place. I had learned to move through it steadily, not shrinking and not performing anything, just moving with the same directness I moved everywhere, making eye contact when it came to that, keeping my expression neutral. The armor of a man who knows what he is and is not asking anyone's permission for it. Elspeth rode beside me and she didn't acknowledge the looks either, which was its own kind of statement. Her chin was level. She'd changed into a dress before leaving the ranch, a plain dark one, functional, and she wore it the way she wore everything, like a tool, not a costume. The bank was on the corner of the main street, stone-fronted and solid-looking in the way that banks of that era made themselves look solid, as if the architecture itself was a form of guarantee. Elspeth went through the door without hesitating and asked the teller for Gruber by name, and the teller looked at her, and then at me, and then went to find him. Gruber was old, as she described, close to 70, white-haired, with the deliberate and considered movements of a man who had been measuring things carefully for a long time and saw no reason to change the habit. He came out from the back, and when he saw Elspeth his face did something complicated and landed at relief. He took her hand in both of his and said her name, and said he had heard disturbing reports from the county about the wedding day, and was very glad to see her standing in his bank. She thanked him and explained what she needed. He looked at me once directly, the same reading inventory she had done at the cut bank, taking me in, deciding something about me, and then he led us to a private room. The lockbox was there. Her father's handwriting on the outside, her name on the authorization card, everything as she'd said. She lifted the box onto the table and it was heavier than it looked, the weight of what was in it and the weight of what it meant. She held it for a moment before opening it. Just held it, both hands flat on the top of it. I stood to her right and Gruber stood back, giving her the space of it, and the room was quiet. Then she lifted the lid and took out the deed and unfolded it and read every line. She had read it before, she knew every word, but she read it again now, carefully, in the way you do when the document is the thing you came for and you don't take it for granted. When she was done, she refolded it and said, "I need the notarized copy and the bank's record of today, with the date and your signature as witness." Gruber said he would prepare them himself. While he was gone, Elspeth stood by the window and I stood beside her. The street outside was going golden with the afternoon sun, the shadows long. The Missouri was visible at the end of the street, brown and wide. She said, quietly, "I didn't let myself believe I'd actually get here until I had it in my hands." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I believe it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He's going to be very angry when this doesn't work." I said, "Let him be." She said, "Anger like his doesn't just stop." I said, "No. But it changes what it can reach when it runs into enough resistance. We make the resistance expensive enough, and the anger stops mattering." She said, "That's what tonight is for." I said, "Yes." We ate at the hotel dining room that evening. The food was good, better than good, the kind of meal that reminds you that people spend their lives learning to cook well, and it is not a trivial thing. Elspeth had a small leather notebook, and she opened it while we ate and she wrote while she talked, two things at the same time in the efficient way of someone whose mind runs faster than one track. She had a contact at the Yankton newspaper, a man who had known her father and who was the kind of journalist who still believed that the purpose of a newspaper was to print what was true rather than what was profitable to print. She had written him a letter from a way station on the trail 2 days ago, pencil on a notebook page, sent with a postal rider she'd paid well, with a summary of events, the name Holt Beaumont, and the county clerk's suspected involvement. She would write a more complete letter tonight, and have it at the newspaper office first thing in the morning. She had a contact at the territorial court as well, through her father's old network. A man who was neither ally nor friend exactly, but who was honest, and who did not like the pattern he'd been seeing in the eastern counties, the way money was working its way into the mechanics of local government. She'd sent him a letter already, a shorter one, from the way station, pencil on notebook paper, and she would write a more detailed one tonight. She said, the notarized record from the bank, documenting her presence here and her claim on the deed, made any legal petition claiming she was absent or missing collapse when it reached a judge who was reading it honestly. The foundation of Beaumont's strategy required her to be unavailable. She was available. She was sitting in a hotel in Yankton eating roasted chicken and taking notes. She said, the newspaper story would make his name ugly in the territory before he had time to respond to it, and visibility was the one thing a man doing what he was doing couldn't afford. What he was doing required shadow. Light was the enemy of it. She said, the territorial court contact might be able to apply a certain kind of pressure on the county apparatus, not dramatically, not in a way that required anyone to publicly accuse anyone else, but in the particular way that a bureaucratic system applies pressure to its component parts when something irregular has been flagged at a level above the irregularity. A letter, a query, a request for documentation on the petition. Nothing that announced itself as opposition, only the weight of legitimate oversight, which was often enough. She put her pen down and looked at what she'd written, and then looked at me. She said, he built this over 8 months, careful, patient, methodical. He met me through arranged introductions, and I didn't see them as arranged until the very end. She paused. I want you to know that I'm not being naive about how good he was at it. He was very good at it. I said he was, but he made one mistake. She said, what was that? I said, he didn't know you. She looked at me. I said, he saw the circumstances and made his calculations from the circumstances. A woman alone, a father's estate, good land, a county apparatus he could buy. He calculated the opposition he'd face, and it didn't include you specifically, because he didn't bother to know you specifically. He knew what you were in general, and made assumptions from that. She was quiet. I said, most people in his position would have gotten away with it. The circumstances were what they were, but the circumstances didn't account for page 9. She said softly, I almost didn't catch page 9. I said, but you did. She looked at the table, at her notebook, the neat lists with their check marks, then she looked up. She said, you had most of this figured out before we got here. She turned it back on me quickly enough that I almost missed it. I said some of it, the structure of what he was doing. Not your specific tools for dismantling it. She said, you're not going to take credit for any of this. I said, you don't need me to take credit for your work. She said, that's not. She stopped. She set her fork down and looked at me directly, the full attention. I didn't need you for this part, I know that. But I needed you for the part before this part, and that part was not nothing. Most men, if a man had pulled me out of that ditch and ridden 4 days with me through hostile country, most men would have arrived at this dinner table with some idea that they were in charge of the situation. I waited. She said, you have never once acted like you were in charge of the situation. You've helped me stay in charge of the situation. Those are different things, and most people can't manage both at once. I said I had enough situations of my own to manage. She said, that's exactly right. That's the whole of it. She looked down at her notebook. There are very few people who understand that the help they're giving someone and the thing that someone is doing are not the same thing, that you can be in something fully, completely, without it becoming yours. I said, it's your land. She said, it's my land. She looked at me, and it's going to stay my land. She went back to writing, and I let her write, and the meal went on around us, and the Missouri was dark outside the window with the last of the evening on it. The ride back was easier. 2.5 days instead of 2 days plus 4 hours. The horses rested, and the trail familiar and Elspeth lighter in some quality that was not carelessness. The deed was in her saddlebag in the oilskin pouch she'd bought at the dry goods store before we left Yankton, and the notarized copies were inside her coat, and she knew where she stood. Knowledge like that changes how a person rides. The body relaxes something it has been holding. We passed through the bluff country on the first afternoon, and the light on the Missouri was extraordinary. The river gone copper and then rose as the sun went down. The sky above it layered in colors that you saw in that country and in no other way. Elspeth pulled her horse to a stop at a gap in the bluffs that looked straight down to the water, and she sat there for a while without saying anything, just looking, and I stopped beside her and we both looked. She said eventually, I forget sometimes how large it is. I said, you don't forget, you stop looking. She said, is that different? I said, in my experience, yes. Forgetting is when the knowledge goes away. Not looking is when you carry it but stop taking it in. She considered that. The light kept changing on the river. She said, which do you think is worse? I said, not looking, because you still have the capacity for the experience and you're just not using it. Forgetting you can't help. Not looking is a choice. She said, that's a harder standard. I said it was meant to be a useful one, not a comfortable one. She made a sound that was close to a laugh. The first time in the days I'd known her that anything had come out of her that sounded like that, small and unguarded, the laugh of someone who hadn't planned to laugh. She caught it and let it go and looked at me with something that was surprised, as if she was the one who'd been startled. She said, I think you might be the driest person I've ever met. I said I'd been compared to the Niobrara at low water. She said, by who? I said by Chayton, who had the same problem. She did laugh then. Brief, full, and she looked away as it happened the way people look away from things that caught them off guard, and then she turned her horse back to the trail and we rode on. The second morning she asked me, at a creek stop where we watered the horses and let them graze in the good grass along the bank, about the future. I said I thought about it every day. She said, what do you see? I thought about it honestly. I said, I saw my son's generation finding forms of life that worked in the world that was arriving, not by surrendering what they were, but by being flexible enough that what they were survived the contact. I saw the land being itself regardless of what the men on it called it or how they divided it, the grass and the stone and the water and the sky being exactly what they had always been, indifferent to the maps. I saw some things that were being lost staying lost, because that was the nature of loss, and it didn't help to pretend otherwise. And I saw some things surviving that people had decided were finished, because the thing about what's actually alive is that it keeps finding a way. She was quiet for a long time after that. The horses grazed and the creek ran. She said, I think about something similar for the land I have. The kind of operation I want it to be, not just profitable, though it has to be that, but the right way. Good grass, good water kept good, the cattle rotated so the ground has time to recover. She paused. My father built it that way and I want to keep it that way. There are ranchers around me who will graze a section until it's bare dirt and move on, and I don't want to be that. I want what I'm running to still be worth running in 50 years. I said, your father taught you well. She said, he taught me everything. We were quiet. The creek went over its stones. She said, after this is settled, after Beaumont is dealt with. I said yes. She said, I'd like you to come back. Not for any reason in particular. Just when you're in this country, come by, have a meal, stay a night if it's late. I let that sit for a moment. She said quickly, less controlled than she usually was, I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. I know you have your own life and your own people and your own obligations. I'm not suggesting anything other than, she stopped, started again. I would like to know you for a long time. That's what I'm saying. I looked at the creek for a moment. I said I was going to say so without you needing to ask. She looked at me. I said, I'll come back. She looked at me steadily for a moment. She said, I wasn't sure if you want to. I said, now you are. She held my eyes for another second, then looked back at the water, and the slight tension in her went somewhere else, and she stood up and dried her hands and went to her horse. We came back to the ranch from the north, down through the upper pasture where Lakota's men had moved the cattle while we were gone. A good decision. I saw immediately. The south pasture getting a rest it needed. We forded the creek at the upper crossing and came through the cottonwoods with the afternoon sun behind us, and Dix was at the gate before we reached it. He said there had been another visit. A man with a badge, county deputy, not territorial, who had come to the south gate that morning and said he had legal papers and needed to speak with Miss Crane about a matter of some urgency. Dix had told him to come back in the morning and he'd get an answer. The man had a badge and he was alone, and Dix hadn't wanted to create a situation before we were back. Elspeth said, is he the kind of man who makes trouble or the kind who does a job? Dix said, came alone, didn't threaten anything, I'd say the second kind. She said, good, then we deal with him in the morning. She had sent 2 letters from Yankton, one to the newspaper, one to her territorial court contact. Those were already in motion, 1 day's riding ahead of us. The deputy was tomorrow's problem and she'd had tonight to prepare for it, which was all she needed. That evening she stood in the yard with the last of the light going and talked through what would happen in the morning. She told Chayton and Motto and the 4 men from Lakota's camp and Dix and Amos, all of them gathered around the yard in the warm evening. She was clear and she was plain, and she said who would be where and what they would do, and she said, "The deputy is not our enemy. He may be an honest man doing a job for dishonest people. We treat him like what he might be, not like what Beaumont is, because if we get that wrong, we make a problem we don't need." She said, "We're going to be visible and calm, and in possession of everything we have a right to possess. And when he comes through the gate tomorrow morning, he's going to see a woman who is alive and legal and unafraid." She looked around the yard, at me last. She said, "Questions?" Nobody had questions. She said, "Get some rest." Dix looked at me in the firelight, and I looked at him, and something passed between us. The recognition of two men who have both just watched the same person run a meeting, and he nodded once and turned away. The deputy came at 9, as he'd said he would. He came alone, which confirmed what Dix had said about him. He stopped his horse at the gate, and he took his time looking at what was in the yard and in the near pasture, the horses, the men moving quiet and unhurried, Elspeth standing on the porch with her hands at her sides and her face even, and he counted, and I watched him count. He rode through the gate when she didn't say not to. He was young, this deputy, 30 or 32, with a clean-kept badge and a nervous habit with his hands that he was clearly trying to break. He stopped his horse in the yard and he looked at Elspeth. She said, "You said you have papers." He reached inside his coat slow and deliberate, showing the motion first, and brought out a folded document. "County Court," he said. "A petition regarding the disposition of your father's estate and certain questions arising." She walked off the porch and took the document from him and read it standing in the yard while he sat his horse and waited. She read the whole thing, every line. It took a few minutes. She said, "This claims I'm missing, that my whereabouts have been unknown since my wedding day." He said that was what the petition said. She looked at him steadily. Then she reached inside her coat and brought out the notarized bank record from Gruber and held it out to him. "This is a certified record from the First Bank of Yankton, dated 4 days ago, documenting my presence in Yankton in person, my signature witnessed and notarized by the bank manager and the bank's notary. I am not missing. I am here." He took it, he read it. He was a careful young man, he read the whole thing. Then she brought out the certified copy of the deed. "And this is a notarized copy of the deed to this property, sole ownership in my name, certified and witnessed." She held it out and he took that too. "Any petition predicated on my absence or on questions about the ownership of this land is without foundation." He looked at the documents in his hands. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm going to need to bring these to the court." She said, "I expected that. I have copies." She produced the second copy of the bank record and held it out. "Take that one. Present it alongside the petition and let the judge decide which is more current." He took it. He folded it and put it inside his coat. He sat there a moment longer. He said, and there was something in his voice that was not exactly apology but was close to it, "Ma'am, I was told you'd gone missing. I wasn't told much beyond that." She looked at him evenly and said, "I believe you. Tell the judge that Holt Beaumont of Omaha filed a petition while I was alive and in possession of this land, and that I contest it entirely." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He touched his hat. He looked at me for a moment, one clear look, the same taking in that careful people do, and I held his eyes and he looked away first, not in fear, not in hostility, just filing something. And then he rode out. Dix let out a breath beside me, long and slow. Motto said something in Lakota to Chayton that I won't repeat here. Elspeth stood in the yard and watched the gate until the deputy was gone and the dust had settled. Then she turned and walked back toward the porch, and as she came up the steps she looked at me. She said, "That's the first part." I said, "Yes." She said, "The newspaper is the second. The court contact is the third." She put her hand on the porch post and leaned on it slightly, and it was the first time in the days I'd known her that I'd seen her lean on anything outside of herself. Just for a moment. Just the weight of the last week settling. She said, "I keep thinking about the wagon, the smell of it. I keep thinking about I was in a ditch in a wedding dress." She stopped. "Then, and you stopped?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't have to." I said, "No." She looked at me. Then she came down the steps she'd gone up and she stood in front of me in the yard and she put her hand on my arm, just above the wrist, her fingers closing around my forearm. Her grip was firm and clear, the way she did everything. She looked at my face and she said, "Thank you, Standing Elk." Not a performance of gratitude. Not an obligation being discharged or a debt acknowledged. The real kind, from somewhere deep and true, from a woman who had looked clearly at what might have happened and what had happened instead, and who understood the difference precisely. I put my other hand over hers. Just briefly, just the weight of it, the acknowledgement. I said, "You did most of it." She said, "I know, but I needed ground to stand on first and you gave me that." She paused. "That's not a small thing." I said I knew. She held my arm for a moment more. Then she let go, and she looked out over the yard with the morning sun on the grass and the cattle moving in the south pasture and the men going about the work of the place. She said, "I'm going to make coffee. Will you stay for it?" I said yes. I stayed 3 more days. Not because she needed me for any particular task, though there was work and I did it. By the second morning after the deputy's visit, it was already clear that Beaumont's legal strategy had encountered the facts and stopped cold. Her territorial court contact. She got a reply by wire, which came to the telegraph office in the nearest town and was brought out to the ranch by a boy on a fast horse. Had seen her letter and moved on it immediately, and the county petition had been suspended pending judicial review of the Yankton documents. The newspaper story ran. She heard later, on the front page of the Yankton paper, with Beaumont's name and a specific enough account of the events, and the suspected involvement of the county clerk that it became a story people talked about at the tables of every territorial official who read a newspaper. Beaumont sent a lawyer, then a different lawyer. Then apparently made the calculation that the Coles survey estimates had been overstated, and the cost of continuing to press on Elspeth Crane's land had exceeded the potential value, and he went quiet. That was how men like that ended things. Not with a concession, not with an acknowledgement of anything, just by turning their attention to the next opportunity and not looking back. She didn't celebrate when she understood he was gone. She nodded once, like a fact confirmed, and went back to her work. I stayed because she asked me to, in the way she asked for things, not formally, not with ceremony, but directly. She said she needed to move the south herd to the upper pasture and could use the help for 2 days. I said I'd help. That was the whole conversation. Chayton and Motto took their leave the next morning. They had their own families and obligations and they'd been from home long enough. I walked them out to where their horses were, and Chayton clasped my arm and looked at me for a moment and said, "I'll tell Lakota it came out right." And I said, "Tell him thank you. Tell the 4 men thank you, and I'll come by his camp before the summer is over." And Motto said, with the particular dry humor he had, that this had been more interesting than checking the cottonwoods for fire damage, and I said most things were. Lakota's 4 men left the day after, back to their own country, carrying a good word from me and the promise from Elspeth, delivered through me, translated, formally offered of beef before the winter and trade goods in the fall. She had said she intended to honor what Lakota had given her, regardless of my feelings about the word repayment. She had said it was between her and Lakota, and I had said she was right and left it there. So it was me and Dix and Amos and Elspeth, the 4 of us, the morning we moved the south herd. It was good working weather, overcast, not hot, the kind of morning that was made for moving cattle. We pushed them out of the south pasture at first light, and by the time the sun had burned off the thin cloud cover, they were through the draw and heading up the grade. Dix and I worked the back third of the herd, which was where the work was hardest, the stragglers, the older cows that had learned to lag and test the patience of the men behind them. They were Elspeth's cattle, which meant they were well handled and not spooky, but they were also cattle, which meant they had opinions. Dix was a good hand. He worked without any waste, his horse and him moving as one thing, and he had the instinct for it, the knowledge of when to press and when to ease off, when a cow was going to break, and when she just wanted to feel she had the option. I had that instinct too, from years of working our own small herds, and we work together the way two people work when they know the same thing in their hands and their legs and don't need to say anything about it. Elspeth and Amos took the flanks and held them clean, which was the part that required the most sustained attention, keeping the edges of the herd from fraying, turning back the animals that decided the grass on the other side of the imaginary line looked better. I could see her working the east flank from where I was, 300 yards off, and she was good at it, patient and precise and moving her horse when it needed to be moved rather than working it constantly. The cattle responded to that. By noon the herd was settled on the high pasture and we were on our way back. Dix was pleased. I could see it in the way he sat his horse, slightly more settled than usual, the satisfaction of a man who has done a job right. He didn't say so, but then Dix was not a man who said things he didn't need to say. In the afternoon, I repaired a fence section on the north boundary that had been pushed out of alignment by an elk or a young bull at some point in the season. The pole had been knocked sideways, and the post it rested on had worked loose from the ground, and the whole section had a lean to it that would eventually invite the cattle to test it. It was simple work, the kind where you pick up a post hole digger and you use it, and then you set the post and you tamp the earth and you lift the rail back into position, and it goes the way it's supposed to go. No subtlety to it, no puzzle. Just the physical sequence of a thing done in the right order, and your hands knowing the sequence, and the satisfaction at the end of it being real and specific. The fence is fixed. The cattle will stay where they belong. That section of the world is in order that was not in order before. I was tamping the earth around the last post when I heard her come through the grass. She had 2 cups of coffee, and she sat on the upper rail of the section I'd already finished and held one out to me. I took it and stood and stretched my back and drank. The coffee was strong and hot and good. She sat on the rail with her cup and looked out over the north pasture. The cattle were visible at the far end, moving slow across the good grass. The sky had gone from its afternoon blue to something deeper. She said after a while, "What does your son know about where you've been this week?" I said he knew I'd gone north to check the cottonwoods on the creek. He wouldn't know more until I got back. She said, "Will you tell him?" I said most of it, the parts that are useful. She said, "What are those?" I thought about it. I set the tamp down and looked at the fixed post and thought about what I would say to him, the actual words, the way I'd tell it. He was 14 and he was sharp, and he didn't need things simplified, but he did need them organized, given to him in the sequence that made them clear. I said, I'd tell him that there are moments when the right thing to do and the thing you are able to do are the same thing, and you are standing in exactly the right place to do them. That this is not common, that when it happens you don't stand there weighing it. You act, because the position found you and the position is asking for something and you have what it's asking for. That this is what being useful means, not having strength or resources or intelligence in the abstract, but having those things in the right place at the right moment and recognizing it when you're there. I said, I'd tell him that helping someone is not the same as taking over from them. That there is a kind of help that removes the person from their own situation, that puts itself between the person and the problem in a way that solves the problem, but costs the person their agency over it. And there is a kind of help that stands beside the person and gives them what they need to solve the problem themselves. The first kind feels like more, because it is louder. The second kind is more, because the person keeps what they started with. Elspeth was very quiet on the rail. I said, I'd tell him that dignity is not a thing you give to people or perform for them. It is a thing you recognize, which is different. When you recognize it in someone, you treat them accordingly, and that treatment is what makes the recognition real. She said after a moment, her voice careful, "Where did you learn that, the last part?" I said, "From my father mostly, and from watching what happened when it wasn't done." She said, "I want to meet your son." I looked at her. She said, "I mean it. When you come back, bring him if he's willing. I'd like to know him." I said I would pass that along. She said, "It's a serious offer." I said, "I know, I'll tell him." She looked out over the pasture again. The light was going long now, going gold, the shadows of the fence posts stretching across the grass in thin lines. She said quietly, "I'm going to write to you. I mean it, not just a note, real letters, what happens here. What the land does season to season, what the cattle do, whether that county clerk ever faces any kind of accounting, and other things, whatever seems worth saying." I said I'd write back. She said, "Good." She paused. "I don't have many people I can." She stopped, reorganized. "There's Dix and Amos, who I trust completely, but they're part of the operation. There's my aunt, who means well. There are my father's old friends who are kind to me out of loyalty to him." She looked at me. "You're the first person in a long time who I've talked to as though we were the same kind of person. Does that make sense?" I said it did. She said, "I think it's because you treat me that way, as the same kind of person." I said, "You are." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she got down off the fence, and we both stood in the grass with our cups and looked at what the afternoon was doing to the light. The last post was solid. I'd checked it already. It held. We walked back toward the ranch house together, our shadows going east in the low sun, long and thin on the grass ahead of us, the way shadows go at the end of a good afternoon, extending themselves toward whatever comes next. I left on the fourth morning. Not at dawn. She'd said once briefly that she didn't have patience for the drama of a dawn departure, that it smacked of a story's ending rather than a fact of the world, and she had a point. So after breakfast, in full daylight, with the horses brought around by Dix, who had done it without being asked, Amos shook my hand from the chair on the porch where he was resting his ankle, still wrapped the way I'd done it, and he said he was grateful for the binding, and I said it was nothing. Dix shook my hand and held it for a moment and said I was welcome on this land any time, and he said it in the particular tone of a man who has made a considered decision and is stating it rather than offering it. He looked me in the eye when he said it. Elspeth walked out to the gate with me. She said, "I'll send the letter to Lakota before the week is out." I said I knew she would. She said, "And I'll write to you as soon as there's anything to report." I said I looked forward to it. Said, and there was something in her voice now that was the closest she'd come in all the time I'd known her to saying something she hadn't already decided, something that was coming out in the moment of saying it rather than after deliberation. "I want you to know that in the last week, I've been able to think more clearly about what I want my life to look like than I have in a long time. And I think you're part of what made that possible. Not because you solved anything for me, because you didn't try to." I looked at her. She said, "I know that doesn't sound like much, but it's rare." I said, "I hear you." She nodded. I put my foot in the stirrup and got up and looked down at her from the horse. She was standing in the gate with the morning sun on the yard behind her, one hand on the post the way she'd been standing that first morning after the deputy, and she looked like herself, exactly, completely like herself, which was what she had always looked like. I realized, even in the cutbank in the wedding dress, even in the first minutes when she didn't know what I was. She said, "Standing elk." I said, "Yes." She said, "Be well." I said, "And you." I turned my horse north. Behind me, the gate made the sound a gate makes when someone closes it carefully. The upper pasture was thick with grass, and the gray mare, I'd left her with Elspeth, she needed a good horse more than Mato needed a backup, was visible through the fence running with two others, loose and easy. The cattle were settled. The morning was clear all the way to the bluffs. I rode at a walk for a while in no particular hurry, through the long grass that brushed my horse's flanks. The land around me was exactly what it had been before any of this, the same grass, the same sky, the same stones showing through the soil at the bluff edges. The land didn't know what had happened on it this week, or didn't care, or knew in some way that wasn't about knowing. It was just itself, the same as always, holding the same water and the same light it had held for as long as anything had been here to hold water and light. I thought about my son, who was learning to move in two worlds at once and was doing it better than I had expected, because he was braver than I was at his age, or more flexible, or some combination of those things that I didn't have a word for in any language. I would tell him most of this when I got back. The parts that were instructive, I'd said, but honestly most of it was. The part about being in the right position and acting when you were. The part about help that didn't turn into ownership. The part about people who read what is actually in front of them, rather than what they expect to see. The bluffs came up ahead of me, and I took the trail that climbed the eastern face, the horse picking her way up the switchbacks with the patience of an animal that has done this before. From the top I could see back across the valley her land, the ranch buildings small in the distance, the creek catching the light at the bend. I stopped there for a moment and looked at it. A man doesn't get many days when he can look back from a high place and know that what he did was right, and that it worked out, and that the right and the working out were not separate things but the same thing, the one producing the other, the way a thing planted in the right ground produces what it was going to produce anyway. I had been in the right position. I had done what the position required. I turned my horse east toward the long trail home, and the sky went all the way to the edge of the world, blue and clear and without bottom, and I rode into it easy and unhurried, the way a man rides when he has done what he came to do, and there is no reason left to hurry and no one waiting for him to perform anything. Just the land, just the sky. Just the quiet of a man with his dignity whole, and a good thing behind him.